Hello, welcome back, regular viewer, loyal subscriber. This is Dragonlance Champions of Krynn. It's a very, nowadays old school game based on the very popular role-playing game Dungeons and Dragons. This particular game was built around the first version of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, AD&D. So for those of you who are only familiar with editions of Dungeons & Dragons after 4th edition, like the current edition, 5th edition, although many of the terms here might seem familiar, there are going to be some subtle differences in the way that this game, this computer role-playing game, uses the rules. It's pretty faithful to 1st edition. Even given that 1st edition was a little bit of a mess, if we're all brutally honest. But then it was the first to try and break this ground of creating a gaming environment which wasn't necessarily about winning or losing. It was more about adopting a character and seeing what's transpired in a narrative sense. Now, of all of the Dungeons and Dragons settings that there have been, Dragonlance is perhaps one of the most popular early settings. It didn't fall too far from the tree in terms of heroic fantasy compared to the likes of Greyhawk, the World of Greyhawk, and Forgotten Realms. But it did some things slightly differently. So, for example, in the first book and the first adventure, the book was called Dragons of Autumn Twilight. The story ran that the gods have abandoned Krynn, the planet, leaving all of the people, the folk, to get on with their own lives. This means that clerical magic has disappeared, and the only magic left in the realms are those controlled by the wizards, in this case. The wizards of 3 separate classes, castes, orders, the orders of wizards. And they are aligned to the classic Dungeons & Dragons alignment system of good, neutral, and evil. And they go so far as to dress in uniforms coloured appropriately. So you have the white robes representing the good wizards, the red robes representing the medium wizards, and the black robes representing the evil wizards. Although, no, they do consider themselves evil. Anyway, this is also underpinned in the game mechanics by the magic of each of these robes, these wizard orders, being subject to the tidal forces of 3 moons, which in orbit around Krynn, only 2 of which are visible. The white moon, Solinari, and the red moon of Luninari. I'm going to get some of these words wrong. Lunitari. The black moon, which does orbit Krynn, is dark. It doesn't reflect light, and so only people with particular senses can detect it in the sky. The setting originally did not have paladins, which was a staple character class of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, at least not initially. Instead, they had an order of knights called the Salamnic Knights, and these too came in 3 orders of knights. Knights of the Crown, which are the lowest order of knights, but still knights and worthy of respect by people. The Order of the Sword, and the Order of the Rose. Now, the Salamnic Knights at the start of the book had been subject to a certain degree of peasant disappointment in that they hadn't been able to prevent the disaster that had befallen the world. They hadn't been able to defend the people effectively from masses of evil things like goblins and the like. And so they had a slightly disreputable and self-serving, perhaps more inwardly looking perspective compared to paladins, who are kind of outside being very missionary and preachy. The Lights of Solamnia walked abroad currying some respect from the peasantry simply because of their status and the fact they were armoured and armed, but never really gaining the respect that perhaps some of them were due, and falling frequently into internecine fighting. Anyway, Champions of Krynn was one of a trilogy of games. I don't know whether they did more than 3, but I've certainly only seen 3. Champions of Krynn, Death Knights of Quinn, and Dark Queen of Krynn, which together formed a trilogy of computer role-playing games, were some of the first in the genre. And in this, much like some of the games after it, you didn't control a single character, you actually controlled a party of characters. You could choose fewer than 6, which is the maximum number of player characters you were allowed to have. Although the game engine supported up to 8 characters, but that would be 6 player characters and 2 non-player characters. But the ability to run a game with 6 different characters, and each of which is designed based on the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons rules at the time, but with the Dragonlance variations of knighthood, wizardiness, and eventually, when the gods return to the planet, priestly magic powers, will give you what you can see here on the screen. I have gone ahead and created the characters because, given the somewhat archaic controls of this game, it was a little bit time consuming to create what is otherwise quite a simple character. I will show you one of the characters to begin with. So this is Sir Storm. Sir Storm is a human male knight of the crown, the lowest order of knights. It's 24 years old. He's lawful good in alignments, which is the most uplifting of alignments and most annoying if you want another look at it. His stats have been modified. Now, the game engine itself rolls stats randomly, and you can spend many a happy hour, if you're anything like me, just pressing next to keep re-rolling the stats in pursuit of something decent. I didn't do that. I actually just saved it with whatever stats it came with, and then at the end you're allowed to manipulate the statistics any way you like, which makes the random rolling perhaps just something of a bit of a Mornington Crescent game, where you feel somehow justified that you haven't cheated if you've only clicked under 150 times to get something with the strength of 1800. So it's worth pointing out that the stats are in the same way as 5th edition, and in fact will be very familiar to the players of 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons, in that they characterize 6 different features of a player character, in this case strength, intelligence, wisdom, dexterity, constitution, charisma. And the scores range from 3, which is the worst possible, to 18, which is the most possible, with the single exception here of strength. Now, in the very first edition of Dungeons and Dragons, there was this rather odd bend in the statistics, where it had been decided that if you were of a fighter type class, and this included rangers and paladins as well as fighters, you would be able to roll a percentage dice, which is nominally a 100-sided dice, but in this case 2 10-sided dice, one for tens, one for units. And that would give you a way of differentiating those people who had maximum human strength. You could still differentiate them to a degree who was going to be stronger and weaker. This was then additionally, warped is the wrong word, but used as a method of differentiating between the races. So, as it was in D&D First Edition, only humans were a playable race with a strength that could be 100 over 18, whereas elves would maximum out at, I think, 75% over 18. Dwarves, you could get quite high, you could get up to 95, 99, but couldn't quite get to that 100% above 18. And even halflings stroke hobbits would never even get to that level, being capped at around 16 strength, so you would never even get into the idea of rolling percentile dice. Each of these was also modified by gender, controversial in current political climates as well, albeit it's when you saw Dungeons and Dragons as more an attempt to simulate, maybe, or model what we might see from a magical feudal medieval society, where women are demonstrably less strong than men because of male puberty and the kind of body changes that happen during that time, where males tend to bulk out because we are sexually dimorphic as a species. This was modelled in D&D by the fact that females of the various races couldn't achieve the levels of strength that the males of the species were, thus making the assumption that elves, dwarves, halflings were all similarly sexually dimorphic as humans, which I never thought should be the case, particularly with the elves, where it struck me that in many of the sort of fantasy settings, the more ambivalent gender nature of the elves would lend itself to a species that was monomorphic, didn't have particular sexual characteristics between the genders, and in fact they were both kind of equally involved in the selection and protection of mates. Just a personal peccadillo. Anyway, so the strength score might look a bit odd to people familiar with 5th edition knowledge. The mention here on the right hand side of steel. Steel is the currency in Dragonlance, presumably because the hordes of thousands of gold doesn't reflect the nature of the real world particularly. You had an armor class. Now, unlike 5th edition, your armor class was better the lower it was, rather than the higher it was. So an armor class here of -2 is incredibly potent. And it reflects the fact that Knights of the Crown start the game with plate mail and a shield and items, and I've equipped them on this character, which means that armor class -2 is the kind of equivalent in 5th edition of 22 armor class. You also have here, instead of a positive modifier to hit, a very weird thing called a THAC0, which stands for to hit armor class 0. So if an opponent had 0 in their armor class, this character would only need to roll 17 or above in order to hit them, so they'd have a 15% chance of hitting them. So of course, if a character has an armor class of say 5, this would then be modified downwards by 5, so they would only need a 12 or better to hit them. So this was cleaned up relatively quickly in Dungeons and Dragons, because it was recognised that people didn't quite get the idea of the less armor class you had, the better you were off, and also the lower your THAC0, the better you were off. It seemed to just make better sense the other way around, and just with a bit of jiggery pokey maths around the likelihood of a d20 rolling particular stats, then you could work this into a better system, which they've done for 5th edition now. And your base damage is based on the weapon you have, which is the dice, giving you a variable number of damage points that you generate on a successful hit, and bonus damage, which is typically a factor of your strength in 1st edition. And that really is it in terms of character design. You can look at these other characters. So Rin Skysteel here is a female hill dwarf. She's a fighter, level 2, with 30 hit points. You can see here that because she's a female dwarf, she doesn't have access to 18 strength, let alone percentage strength above that. So from a min-maxing point of view, it would make a great deal more sense for me to play a human male in here to get 1800. But it kind of runs against the idea of playing the kind of characters that you want, doesn't it? Constitution 19 here exceeds the normal human maximum. That's because dwarves have a special dispensation in terms of constitution. Similarly, elves have a dispensation in terms of dexterity, breaching 18 as a starting character. Same as the halfling equivalents in Dragonlance that are called Kenda. They have a more wandering troubadour aspect compared to Tolkien-esque halflings. So whereas your typical halfling might prefer to stay at home in a comfortable hole in the ground and snack and drink most of the day, your itinerant Kenda, particularly at a young age, would suffer from wanderlust and tends to go from town to town and get themselves into all sorts of trouble. Because Kenda have particular abilities to wind other races up, a skill that they've called the Taunt, and they are at least reputed to be incredibly light-fingered. This is partially a social mores problem, given that the Kenda don't really believe in property, given that they pick up stuff that's been left lying around, even if that means it's in someone's pocket. But they don't think very much of the fact that if somebody steals it, if it disappears from their pouches one day and ends up in the possession of somebody else, they're more likely to be grateful that they picked it up because, clearly they've just left it lying around. Anyway, so I've created these 6 characters. Savaben Storm is the Knight of the Crown, Rin Skysteel, the Dwarven Fighter, Prince Kaiserian, Sylvanesti Elf. That's the Dragonlance equivalent of a High Elf. They're very aristocratic, believe themselves to be the height of culture and artistic endeavour within Ansalon, the setting for Dragonlance. The brain and words. Country? No, continent. Ansalon is the continent. Thank you. I then have a brother and sister. Sorry, Prince Kaiserian is a fighter, a ranger cleric. I have brother sister Qualinesti elves here, the Iman Thalas and Ashling Thalassa. Iman Thalas is a fighter magic user cleric, and Ashling, which I'll call her for short, or Ash, is a cleric magic user. And then I have the discussed Kenda Sammy Oakfoot, who is our Kenda cleric thief. I've used a lot of multi-classes in here. Multi-classing in first edition, particularly Advanced Dungeons Dragons, was a very different affair. So rather than just sequentially earning a class in fighter, and then for your second character level you would earn a character level in cleric, and you would gain first level abilities from both. The way it worked in first edition AD&D is that your character would put half of the experience points they earned into each class, and thus would develop considerably slower than a single class character, but would gain full abilities of each when they leveled up. In gaming impact, it was also weird that humans weren't allowed to multi-class. One of the benefits of being non-human was that you could multi-class. Being one of the benefits of human was that you could dual class, and dual classing was you would advance in a single class for a while until you reach, let's say, 6th level, And then you go, you know what, I'm tired of being a fighter, I'm going to start being a wizard. At which point you would shuck off your armour, your helmet, you would drop your swords, you would pick up the spellbook and a staff, and you would be a wizard from wizard first level, the only difference being you had the hit points of a fighter. But you would have to stick to your second class until you reached an equivalent level to where you'd left off your fighting, at which point you could blend the two. So you could suddenly put your armor back on and, you know, do weird stuff. And it was odd even then that dual classing and multi-classing were weird things. They're always optional rules. It was fully embraced in this game, and because of the length of the game being quite an epic trilogy, they became quite powerful characters. Anyway, I'm going to be recording a few episodes of me going through this game. I played it to death when I was a boy, and have a lot of happy memories. And I'm a bit nervous because you should never go back, should you? But I saw these games available for very little money, and it's a touch of nostalgia retail therapy, I'm afraid. I picked them up and decided to have another go at it, and so I will. I'll record them and I'll see if they make decent video fare. If they do, I'll pop it on and you can tell me whether you like it or not. And if you don't like it, don't watch it. And anyway, that's it for me today. That's the introduction to Champions of Krynn. And I hope you come with me on the next one as we begin to investigate the continent of Ansalon, and playing through the period after the initial Dragonlance stories have been completed, where evil has been apparently routed from the land and driven to the wilds and the borders, and we've been sent to an outpost to make sure that evil doesn't spring up again, which of course it will. Yes, anyway, good stuff. So thank you for joining me, and hopefully that will whet your appetite, and I will see you very soon. Cheerio.
I fought with lions and wolves, but I've never fought myself before. It's over everything I